Okay, so the first question is, why are today's large reactors encountering difficulties competing with non-nuclear alternatives? Next slide. Well, hurdle one, economics. Let's take a look at what the problem is there. Okay, this is something I drew off the internet. The thought was, or there are two ways in which economies of scale can play with regard to power reactors. One is that as you make the reactor larger the size of the reactor, the more electricity it can produce. And the costs for producing a larger reactor are not proportional. In other words, you can make a larger reactor, or a reactor that is, let's say, twice the size of another reactor, for less than twice the construction costs. And so the argument would be, well, you can make cheaper electricity if you make the plant bigger. Another way to think about this is, if you go on an airplane, you can go on a Learjet, which can seat maybe 4 people, and it's pretty expensive for those 4 people. But if you get on a 737, there's about 140 people on that plane, and the cost to fly those people per person actually is much lower than that little jet. So as you get larger, you can carry more passengers. In this case, as you get larger, you can produce more electricity without spending quite as much money as the increase in electricity would afford. Now, one way to look at this is on this curve. As the reactor gets larger, the economies of scale get better, and the cost per kilowatt as a function of capital costs, or what it costs you to build the plant, goes down. Now, at some point, it plateaus, and I suppose if you keep trying to make the plant super big, you run into engineering problems, and it gets more expensive. Another way in which economies of scale come into play in this discussion that we're going to have tonight is what it costs to make each reactor. If you make a lot of reactors, just like if you make a lot of cars, the cost per unit should come down if you have economies of scale with regard to building a lot. All right. So for the most part, what we're focused on is the first part of the argument, which is, well, if you make the reactor bigger, it'll make more electricity, and it should be cheaper for the construction cost to produce more electricity. So the capital cost, they call it, per kilowatt hour should be, installed kilowatt hour should be less. Let's go to the next chart. This is a dated chart. This goes back to basically data that ran out in 2012, which is about 8 years ago. But if I kept it up to date, those arrows would still be going up. And what are those arrows? Well, imagine you could build a nuclear power plant overnight. Literally, in 24 hours, you could build a nuclear reactor. That would mean that you wouldn't have to pay any cost for borrowing money, because you could build it overnight. Now, people who want to know what the costs of the construction are like this number, because actually it takes sometimes years, I would say, depending, 4 to 13 years to build a nuclear power plant. And during that time, you're paying off a loan for all the construction work, and that adds immensely to the cost. So what they say is, what we'll do is we'll ignore the financing cost. Let's imagine what it would cost if we could build this thing magically overnight. Well, so if anything, these numbers are lower than what it really costs to build a plant, because in the real world, you don't build it overnight. You build it, over a period of time, and you got to pay money on the loan to have all that construction stuff that you bought to make the darn thing. But let's use this because it's pretty conservative. If anything, it's favorable to nuclear power to view the costs in an overnight cost fashion. Well, even using this metric, historically, as these plants came online and became bigger, and these are some of the biggest ones, the cost of these monsters kept climbing. And in fact, if you put this chart out to 2020, those arrows all would be going up even further, much further than they are here. Let's, now you could say, well, why? Why did they go off? Well, one of the reasons they went up is they kept changing and improving the design because they learned what safety would require. there were increased costs for building, and we'll see this, for a variety of reasons having to do with complexity. And then there were increased labor costs, which I think is the least of it. I don't think that's the main driver. Let's go to the next chart, just to take a look at some of the examples. Here's an example in the United States. Now, this is a Westinghouse plant, and it's being built in Georgia with a lot of federal money actually involved. It's behind schedule, which adds to the carrying costs, which are the loan costs. It's now $13.2 billion over budget. I think what's of interest, though, is that the total cost per kilowatt, with regard to how much it costs to build, they call it the installed, what it costs for installed kilowatt, is about 12 cents right now. It may go higher. That is pretty high.
Don't you mean kilowatt hour there?
Kilowatt hour, I'm sorry. We dropped the letter there. Sorry. Yes. Let's go to the next chart. Here's another project, which also is the latest. This is a product by the French being built in Great Britain. And this plant is big. It's about 1,600 and some odd megawatts electrical. And it is coming in at around 11 cents per kilowatt hour now. And it also is behind schedule and way over its original budget. Construction started only about a year ago, and it's already $8 billion over budget. So let's go to the next one. Here is another example. This is a similar plant built in France, and it was it's now 3 times over budget from its original, and it's coming in now at about 13 some odd billion dollars, which, again, is not what they originally thought. The next chart. Here's one of those reactors being built in Finland. It was supposed to cost a little less than $4 billion. It's now coming in around $12 billion, and it was supposed to be done some time ago, and it's 12 years behind schedule. So these reactors, I think Peter pointed this out, all of them were supposedly going to enjoy economies because they were modular, that many portions of the reactor could be made off-site and then carried to site in a factory. Those economies that were going to be realized because of this apparently did not pan out as well as they hoped. And these plants are quite large, but the cost for the electricity and in relation to the investment needed to build them has gone up in comparison to previous reactors. They are as large as they come, but it hasn't helped.